So as we start first, I want to thank all of you for your prayers this past week. We got back yesterday afternoon, I suppose, not yesterday evening, but about 3 to 4 o'clock yesterday we got back, unloaded, and we're home from a whirlwind adventure in New Orleans. And thank you for your prayers. It rained every day, but it did not rain while we were doing sports clinics and the vacation Bible school programs, and that was an amazing blessing because, yes, it may have been a little soggy, but we were still there. And in the midst of everything, God met us, and I appreciate your prayers because without that, it would not have happened. So thank you for that first. And also bear with me in case I say something, because after being in the South for a little bit, you might hear a couple y'alls and some of that crop up. Because strangely enough, I'm a linguistic chameleon. And so yesterday as we got ready to get back on the bus, I'm like, all right, come on y'all, let's get out of here. And I realized that had just come out of my mouth. And I was like, man, it's a good thing I haven't slept that much. I can blame it on that. If it happens today, just roll with me. You can pretend you're still in New Orleans with me. But this story is one of my favorites in Scripture because it mirrors one of my favorite TV shows. The line in Star Trek is, "These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, boldly going where no man has gone before." Abram gets that from God. It starts, God shows up and he talks to Abram and he says, leave everything you know, everything you've got, and go. And he doesn't tell him, you're going to go here or you're going to go there. He says, and go to a land that I'll show you. Which is always exciting because as much fun as it is to not know what you're doing, most of us like to have a plan. We like to have a map. We generally like to have reservations so you don't wind up at that hotel that has no vacancy. And we plan things. Abram doesn't get a plan. God shows up. God talks to him and he says, leave. And Abram does, which to many of us is crazy. I mean, normally I don't think about just, I'm going to hop in the car, I'm going to drive somewhere because God spoke to me. I'm probably going to blame it on the burrito I ate at Taco Bell or, maybe something else. But I'm not just going to hop up and leave, but Abram does. And in this text, the first thing you see is God says to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land I will show you. Now to us, that's not a big deal because leaving our parents is a very natural part of our society. We leave to go to college. We leave to take a job, and we try to get out on our own. It's part of the American psyche that you have to accomplish something on your own, not be attached to your parents' coattails anymore. However, in the ancient Near East, culture was your family was everything. You lived with them. They were your security. They were all you had in life. And here you've got Abram, and God says, leave everything you've known, everything that keeps you safe, and everything that is wrapped up in your future in that place. Leave. It doesn't sound like what I would really like to do. For God to show up and say, hey, Matt, you look nice and comfy, but please leave everything you know. Leave a security of having what you need met and go to where I'm going to show you. No GPS, no map, no destination even, except the land that I will show you. But Abram leaves. Part of that comes from an existing relationship with God. We know that he has to have had an existing relationship because when God speaks, Abraham recognizes his voice. He hears it and he knows that voice to be God. He doesn't question it. He doesn't, like I do, blame it on Taco Bell. He hears it and he recognizes that voice. This past week, I had, a ton of voices clamoring for my attention regularly. But there's one of those voices that always cut through the crowd. Why? Because that's the voice that calls me Dad. It's the one that I'm trained to hear through a long time period. I mean, as much as I love each of our students, and as much as I try to always focus, if I hear that voice say Dad, it cuts out a lot clearer. Abram had that experience. He knew the voice of God and he heard it. And he left. But there's more to it than just getting up and leaving. Look at what God told him. This is the first time we hear the covenant God makes with Abraham. God tells him, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. And you know, if God stopped right there, most of us would generally be good, because we have this deep-seated desire for fame, for worth, to be wrapped up in what we've done. Like while we were in New Orleans this last week, guess who was there too? American Idol. How I know is because I had to reroute our bus through a not-so-happy one-way stretch of downtown to get where we needed to be, because American Idol had streets closed and everything, because there were still enough people wanting to audition that they had to have this huge area blocked off. And especially when you think about it, tons of those people are going to be told, you know, you're ridiculously horrible. Please never sing again. And they're sitting out in the heat sweating for the privilege of being told that, just with the hope that they're going to be that one that they're like, wow, you got talent. You should come with us. And they're doing that because of our deep-seated natural need for fame and worth. We want people to recognize us, to know us, and to look at us and go, wow, they've got something going on. And that's what God promises Abram. He says, I'll bless you, I'll make you famous, but then he says, and I'll make you a blessing to others. If I was hearing that, I'd say, all right, sweet. So I'm going to get hooked up, and that's the important part, and I'll bless others. All right, I can go with that. It sounds good. And then God continues. He says, I'll bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who treat you with contempt. But then the key comes here. All the families on the earth will be blessed because of you. That is huge. It starts with this stuff about Abram. He's going to be a great nation. He's going to have many descendants. He's going to have this land. He's going to be blessed and famous. That appeals to us. And that is what we naturally crave. But God also turns it on its head and says, yes, I'm going to bless you and take care of you. But I'm not doing it for you. He instead says he is doing it so that every family on the earth could be blessed. As we've traced the covenant from Genesis 1 all the way to here in chapter 12, it's this arc of the story that shows us falling and failing in the garden. To Cain and Abel in the first murder, to the earth being so incredibly wicked and evil that God had no choice but to hit the reset button with a flood. And after Noah, the earth begins to populate again. And then we come to this man named Abram. And at this point in the story arc, we see that God has much more in mind than just one person's needs. He's focused on the entire planet. And Abraham is told this. At the time, his name is still Abram. He hasn't had his name changed. But God is making him promises that he's going to be something special, not just in his own time, but for all time. To the point where we sit here today because of what God started with Abram. That he'd be a blessing to the entire planet. And he was. Because he trusted God. Now the key here, God says leave, and all of this great stuff's going to happen. But what did Abram have to do first? He had to leave. Now his leaving is predicated on his knowledge of God, his relationship with him, because he recognized that voice. He didn't blow it off. He didn't blame it on something he ate. He didn't even decide it was some crazy conversation in his own head. A friend of mine has had some of these moments where God has put a nudge in his heart. One of which, we're at church, we were talking, and Craig had this deep-seated desire and feeling that he needed to give what was in his wallet to a lady on the other side of the church. He didn't know her. He'd never seen her. But he couldn't shake it throughout the service. He's like, God, I know you're telling me to do something, but it just sounds crazy. Why would I go give her what's in my wallet? And as a young, college-age male, Craig opened his wallet, had a $5 bill, and figured, it's $5. I can do this. Service ends. Craig walks across the sanctuary to where this lady is still sitting. And he says, ma'am, you're going to think I'm crazy, but God has put you on my heart this morning, and I just wanted to give you this. And he hands her a $5 bill. At which point she begins to weep, crying and just overjoyed because, as she tells him, she was a single mother. And she felt like she needed to be at church. First time she'd been in ages. But she felt like she needed to be there, but she didn't have enough gas in her tank to make it to work that week because she drove all the way to church. And to put this in perspective, this was when gas was still 79, 89 cents a gallon. So $5 actually meant something. Today, it's all right, you've got enough to drive down the street for about 2 blocks, and then you're going to be out. But at the time, $5 meant she had a full gas tank. And for this single mother, it was the world to her in that moment. Because Craig listened to the nudge that God had given him. And as he's related, as he got older, as he got wiser, he had the same kind of feeling one Sunday morning. And there's a gentleman sitting on the other side of the church, and he felt like God was really, really telling him to do the same thing. And so Craig opened his wallet, and he took a look. But all that was in there was a $100 bill. And Craig told me, he decided it must have been a burrito he ate the night before or something, because God definitely wasn't telling him to do that. And as he related, he was fine with a $5 faith. He could totally handle that. When you moved it up to the $100 faith and he knew what he could do, what his children needed, he couldn't do it. He said, I wish I could tell you that he'd given the money to that gentleman and had that moment to bless him and to be blessed, because when he gave the last $5 in his wallet, strangely enough, shortly after that, somebody from the church came and said, hey, Craig, I've heard a lot about you. I'd love to take you out to lunch. So the $5 he thought he had for lunch that he gave away to bless a lady, he was blessed. He had lunch. And he's told me, he's wondered what God might have done if he'd listened and given that $100, if he had faith enough. But we'll never know. But we're each faced with those moments throughout our life. How much do we know God? How much do we believe in our God? Because how well we know him influences how ready we are to hear his voice. And how ready we are to hear and recognize his voice dictates what we're going to do when we hear it. Abram heard the voice. He recognized it. He knew it was his God speaking. And he left. Total trust. He left his security. He left his family. He left his home. And he goes. And so we know him as the father of faith, because he had total trust in his God. He didn't say, God, that sounds great for somebody else. God, that sounds great if you tell me where we're going. That sounds great, God, but I like it here. Instead, Scripture says simply, Abram left as the Lord had instructed. At 75 years old, he gets up and leaves. No ifs, no ands, no buts. Because he knew God, he knew his voice, and he had total trust that God's plans for him were bigger than his doubts. God's plans for him were bigger than his questions. God's plans for him were beyond what he could comprehend. Because his God, who he trusted, just told him that he was going to be blessed. He was going to be famous, but also that he was going to be a blessing to others, and that every single person on the planet would be blessed because of him. And so he goes, and we look at it and think, man, I don't know if I could do that. And a lot of us get stuck at the stage where we have a $5 faith, and we're fine with that because it's easy. We get to maintain our comfort. But when we're really asked to stretch, to move beyond that, we're tempted to let it go and to not do what God has put in front of us. We'd rather stay than leave. And that leads us to the question, when you have a relationship with God, how well do you recognize his voice? Does it cut through the noise of every day? Because I know all the facts on teenagers, but I'm sure many of us have the same. There's music going in your car. Many of you have the radio on at work. And we have music, we have noise, we have something engaging our attention every moment of the day. I mean, the average teenager in a week consumes more media than the average adult does in a month. There's noise, there's distractions, there's all of this going on. The question is, how much do we trust that voice? Now, this week, while we were in New Orleans running sports clinics and Bible club, vacation Bible school type programs with some of these kids, there was one moment where we had a small little incident. Two of the boys had been throwing water at a third boy because it rained. There were puddles. There's water. And what do boys do? They throw it at each other because that's what boys do. There's mud because really, definition of a boy, in case you didn't know, it's noise with mud on it. I know. There's lots of times. But these boys are playing until one of them gets fed up. He throws a stick at the other two. At which point, we have to create a little bit of separation. We had to kick into bouncer mode. I was on my way back from a short little hop down the road in the bus when the phone rings, and it's Dayton Winter, my summer intern. And he says, "Hey, Matt, what do I do?" And I'm like, wow, this sounds fun. I get there, I hop out of the bus, we come out, and there's these two boys who are going to get their licks on this third one who threw the stick. And for some strange reason, he's hiding behind Dayton Winter and Ben Hodges and some of the guys who were there breaking up the incident. Well, these other two are talking about they're gonna get their licks on him because they have to, man. He did his thing. And that's what they're doing. I'm trying every trick in my book from the, I tried distracting him with fruit snacks. The bribery aspect did not work. So I'm like, okay, bribery's out. Maybe some, advanced psychology from those classes I had in seminary and college. No, that didn't work. I finally resorted to the only thing I had. I said, hey, Percy, either you're going to calm down and we're going to talk about this, or we're going to have to say that you can't come back tomorrow. And I don't want to do that. We love you. We don't want that to happen. That didn't faze the kid. I'm like, great. So I'm telling you can't come back tomorrow. We got this, we got that. He doesn't care. Until a gentleman named Chris shows up. Chris is 21, and he was out there at the park with some of the little guys. Chris is walking his little midget dog, Scruffy. And he walks up and he says, hey, what's going on? We tell him. Chris looks at Percy and says, man, you got to stop that. And you know what happened? It's like flipping a switch. I'm going, I tried everything I had and couldn't make it anywhere through. Chris walks up. He's a voice that Percy recognized. And he was an authority that he trusted. And all of a sudden, instead of trying to get their licks on Amari, they stop because they heard a voice they recognized, and it was an authority that they trusted. And so no longer were they going to push with what they had. They heard something that made them stop, that made them listen to what was being said, that my words could have never had the effect on. As much as I'd love to think I have that persuasive influence, would have never happened. I would have had to send the kid home. Many of us hear the voice that we recognize and trust, but we don't necessarily want to listen to what it says. Sometimes it means doing something that's completely outside of our comfort zone. Other times, it might mean doing something that we don't necessarily want to do because it might get us dirty, or maybe it's something that's going to make us uncomfortable. And the question for you this morning is, do you know God well enough to recognize his voice? And if you recognize his voice, do you trust him enough to do what he said? Are you willing to step out of the comfortable $5 faith and to move towards something that's more stretching? Because really, that's where it all happens. If Abram had not left, the way the covenant is structured here, God is laying out his conditions on everything else happening after that. Because one important aspect of a covenant is it was always based in relationship. Abram had a relationship with God, knew his voice, and trusted him, so that when God shows up and says, leave your home and go where I'm going to show you, and then I'll make all this good stuff happen over here. Abram was willing to do it. And here's the kicker. Because of his faith, we have the chance to sit here. We have the chance to have the same relationship with God, to get to know his voice and to get to follow where he leads. Yeah, God's probably not telling you, hey, this morning you really need to pack up and go to Africa. I'm not thinking God's doing that. If he is, listen. But God probably has something in mind for you. What's it going to be? I don't know. But God is calling each of us to do something not for us, but rather to be a blessing to others. To, like Abraham, step out so that he can bless the entire planet. That is the call and the covenant. It's not just go because I'm going to take care of you. That sounds great, and I am totally in for God taking care of me. But the call is to be blessed so that we can be the blessing poured back out. Because God's love isn't just for us. God's love and God's plan from the beginning was to overcome us so that his love could reach all of us. And that's our call today. To hear God's voice when he calls, to recognize it, but more than just hearing it, is to do something about it. Because if we recognize the voice, we trust it, but we do nothing, we mitigate the first two. Because we say that, yeah, we know your voice, we trust you enough for $5. But not necessarily to take that step beyond our comfort level, beyond what we think we can do, beyond what we thought we were capable of. And this week, I was privileged enough to see a lot of our students step beyond their comfort level. Some of our students who I didn't think would ever say anything out loud are all of a sudden leading groups in VBS and other programs. Some of our students who might not necessarily speak normally are sharing where they saw God working. Why? Because they were willing to step out of their comfort zone and do something where they heard God's voice. And when they responded to what God did, it wasn't for themselves. Because yes, they were blessed. But it was so that they could bless others. And that is what he's calling us to today. To not be so wrapped up in ourselves that we ignore what's going on around us. To not be so afraid to try that we wind up paralyzed. To trust his voice and to go, to do, and to love as he loved us. Because if Abram never left, the covenant would not have been affirmed. Because Abraham had to do his part of the covenant. And God took care of his. And he still does today. So, do you know God? Do you recognize his voice? Do you trust him enough to do what he says? That's the question. And our response and our answer isn't just for us. It's for every single person around us. Let's pray.